Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Tonight we're traveling to the frozen edges of the world with 8 true Appalachian Mountains horror stories. Encounters that prove the real danger isn't always the cold. It's what's hiding in the dark. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, let's step into the Appalachian Mountains together. Story 1. My name is James. At 26, I reached a point where I had to disconnect from everything and everyone. It wasn't a nervous breakdown or some premature midlife crisis. It was more like hitting a mental off switch. The idea of hiking a section of the Appalachian Trail by myself seemed like the perfect solution. Not the entire trail, of course, just a reasonable loop that would take about a week. It started near a small North Carolina town called Elkridge, not far from Hot Springs, and was supposed to wind back toward a spot named Blinn Hollow. The route seemed isolated enough to avoid crowds, but close enough to civilization that I could pull out if necessary. I kept it low-key. I informed my manager I was taking personal time and sent a brief text to my sister saying I'd be unreachable for a while. That was the extent of it. No social media announcements, no GPS check-ins, no tearful farewells. The very last thing I wanted was a constant stream of messages, asking if I was having a profound personal revelation. That wasn't the purpose of the trip. I wasn't seeking healing. I was just exhausted, the kind of tired you feel from the constant hum of fluorescent office lights. I wanted to hear the sound of my own thoughts again, or even better, to hear nothing at all. The initial 3 days were precisely what I had been craving. Long, silent expanses of trail enveloped in dense greenery. When you're that deep in the wilderness, you begin to observe the small details, like the myriad shades of moss or the texture of tree bark when you press your full weight against it. Your senses seem to heighten. I experienced that satisfying sort of exhaustion you can only get from a full day of hiking, where your muscles ache in a way that feels earned and productive. I subsisted on those awful dehydrated meals, slept beneath a tarp, drank water filtered from streams, saw a few deer, and even caught sight of a bear on a faraway ridge. It paid me no mind, and I certainly wasn't looking for an encounter. I was being careful, exceptionally careful, to be honest. I hung a bear bag each night. My fire safety was impeccable. I constantly cross-referenced my maps with landmarks and noted potential emergency exit points. I had contingency plans for my contingency plans. That level of organization provides a sense of comfort when you're completely alone out there. It gave me a feeling of being in control. On the 4th night, everything changed. I established my camp in a hollow just north of Devil's Thread Gap, roughly 10 miles beyond the midpoint of my trek. A dry creek bed and a clearing with a natural rock formation to block the wind were nearby. It struck me as an ideal location. I boiled some water, ripped open a pouch of powdered lasagna, which was still repulsive, and sat on a decaying log, scrolling through a book on my phone. Just as I started to unwind, it struck me. The smell. It was sudden, pungent, and chemical, like a combination of blood and leaking. Battery acid with an undercurrent of something putrid. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was fundamentally wrong. You know that instinctual tug your brain gives you when it senses danger before your conscious mind can process it? It was exactly like that. My first thought was that an animal must have died somewhere close. I got up and conducted a slow, methodical search of the vicinity. I peered under bushes, climbed a short way up the slope to get a better view, and inspected the tree line. There was nothing. No dead animal, no circling vultures, no claw marks or tracks, not so much as a disturbed leaf. The woods were just still, unnaturally still. I didn't linger after that. I forced down my food, rechecked my bear hang, and zipped myself into my tent before the sun had fully set. Sometime past midnight, I was woken by the sound of footsteps. They were slow and measured, each step deliberately placed on the dry leaves and twigs. They weren't hurried or animalistic. I've heard the sounds of raccoons, foxes, and even deer making their way through the forest. This was different. This was intentional. I sat bolt upright in my sleeping bag, holding my breath, listening intently. The steps made a single, perfect circle around my tent. Then, they ceased directly behind my head. There was no rustling, no beam from a flashlight, no voice, just absolute silence. I didn't move to unzip the tent. I didn't even flinch. I was clutching a knife inside my sleeping bag, my fingers wrapped so tightly around the handle that my hands started to go numb. I waited. I believe I remained in that position until the sky began to lighten and the birds started their morning chorus. The next morning, I inspected the ground behind my tent. There were footprints, and they weren't mine. The soles were almost entirely smooth, reminiscent of old-fashioned leather footwear, and the toes were angled slightly inward, as if the person walked with their feet turned in. That minor detail was what truly unsettled me. I'm not sure why, but it did. It felt unnatural, as if there was something fundamentally wrong with the way this individual moved. I packed my gear in a hurry, skipping breakfast and stretches. I just started walking and didn't stop until my legs were burning. I bypassed my next planned campsite, ignored my scheduled breaks, and only paused long enough to guzzle water before pressing on. The smell followed me. It would come and go, sometimes faint, other times overpowering, a mix of rust and decay, and something else, something cloyingly sweet, like overripe fruit. It made no sense. No dead thing tracks you for 10 miles. That evening, I chose a spot high on a ridge, where the trees were thin, affording me a clear view in every direction. I hoped it would make me feel more secure. It did not. I didn't build a fire. I didn't cook. I crawled into my tent and gripped that same knife as if it were an extension of my hand. Then, around 2 in the morning, I woke again. There was breathing, slow, steady, human breathing, originating from just beyond the tree line. It wasn't moving, nor was it panting. It was just watching. Then the footsteps began anew. Crunch, crunch. They didn't circle this time. They came directly for the tent. Through the fabric, I could see a silhouette, a tall, slender form, outlined by the moonlight. It was carrying something. A stick? No, it was longer, more like a staff or perhaps a pole. It stopped just outside my tent and tapped it once. That was it. Just a single tap, like a finger rapping on a window pane. Then it turned and walked away. The smell lingered on the tent long after it was gone. I didn't get any sleep after that. I didn't even sit down once the sun rose. I packed my belongings in 10 minutes and took a shortcut I had marked on my map, a service road that I knew would eventually lead me toward the highway. Late that afternoon, with my legs barely able to function, I came upon an old hunting shack. It was barely upright, with only 3 walls, half a roof, and rotting timber. I ducked inside to catch my breath. That's when I noticed the carvings. Dozens of names had been scratched into the wood above the doorframe. Some were just initials, others were full names. Every single one was accompanied by a date. Some were from the 1980s, others were more recent. The latest one was dated just 3 days prior. Directly beneath that name was an empty space. It wasn't subtle at all, just a conspicuous blank spot, as if it were waiting for the next entry. I sat there, knife still in hand, my heart feeling like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I spent the entire night in that shack. I didn't sleep, I just listened. Every crackle from the woods outside made me certain it had returned, waiting for darkness, but it never reappeared. The moment it was light enough to see, I took off down the road. I walked until I saw a ranger's truck. I must have looked like I'd just emerged from a cave. The ranger asked if I was all right. I told him I'd seen a bear and gotten disoriented trying to give it a wide berth. He didn't inquire further. When I got back home, I sold all of my hiking equipment, maps, boots, even my water filter. I haven't been on a trail since. Story 2. I always considered myself fairly competent in the woods. I wasn't a survivalist by any means, but I'd been camping and hiking, and I didn't panic at the sound of every snapped twig. So, when my cousin Ben invited me to his family's property near Waverly, Virginia, for a week last August, I agreed without hesitation. They owned a large log cabin situated far beyond the reaches of anything that could be considered civilization. There were no neighbors, no cellular service, and no glow from distant city lights. Just a boundless forest that began where their property ended and seemed to stretch on infinitely. Ben and I had spent our childhood summers together, and even after we both went off to college, we'd managed to maintain the tradition. We were both 20 years old now, legally adults, but whenever we were together, it was the same old inside jokes, the same contest to see who could consume more junk food from a gas station, or whose university was more mentally draining. A few days into my visit, we were struck by boredom. There was no Wi-Fi, no girls around, and there's a limit to how much Mario Kart 1 can play before existential dread sets in. That's when Ben mentioned the fire tower. "There's one way up past Ridgepoint Bluff," he said, casually tossing the idea out while we were in the middle of a grilled cheese lunch. "It's about 3 miles in, super sketchy, but still standing. You can see the entire county from the top." I paused, a bite of my sandwich halfway to my mouth. "You've been up there?" "Once. Sophomore year. We did a night hike. The whole thing was terrifying, not gonna lie. But it was also pretty amazing." I arched an eyebrow. "A night hike through an unmarked forest? Yeah, that sounds like a hard pass for me." Ben shrugged. "Come on, man. We've done stupider things. I brought headlamps. It'll be an adventure. We can camp on the platform, cook some food, do the whole wilderness bonding thing." I wavered, but only for a moment. He was right. We had done stupider things. Besides, I didn't want to be the one to back down from what sounded like a potentially epic experience. So, we started packing around 8:30 that evening. Ben gathered the absolute necessities: 2 inexpensive sleeping bags, a miniature camp stove, some packets of instant ramen, and a worn-out tent, just in case. I added 2 flashlights, my lighter, a water bottle, and the folding knife my uncle had given me for graduation. Just the weight of that knife in my pocket made me feel slightly more prepared for venturing into the unknown. We set out just before 9 p.m. The sun had mostly set, but a faint sliver of light remained in the sky, just enough to discern shapes. The trail, or what Ben asserted was a trail, began behind his backyard and immediately plunged into a dense canopy of trees. It was a narrow, uneven path, the kind that only exists because a few deer have trampled it down over the decades. Every few steps, I found myself ducking, under branches or stepping over half-exposed roots. I tripped on one so badly that I nearly fell flat on my face within the first 5 minutes. "Should have worn shin guards," I grumbled. Ben just chuckled and continued walking. Welcome to nature's obstacle course. After the first 15 minutes, we fell silent. The woods were unsettling. I hadn't realized how accustomed I was to constant background noise until I became aware of its complete absence. There were no crickets, no frogs, not even the buzz of mosquitoes. The only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves as we brushed past vegetation. It felt as though we were moving underwater, with everything muffled. Then, we came across a rusted-out old truck. It was listing sideways against a tree, as if it had been deposited there by a crane. The windows were all shattered, moss was creeping over the hood, and vines snaked through the broken grill. Ben gestured toward it. "That's been there forever. Some old logging truck. I think it lost a wheel. Nobody ever bothered to haul it out." We joked that it looked like the opening scene of every horror movie ever made. The kind where the camera focuses on a strange object, and you just know someone is about to meet a grisly end. About half an hour later, we discovered something hanging from a tree branch. Initially, I thought it was just a decoration, like one of those tin can wine chimes people sometimes make. But as we drew closer, I saw that it was made of bones. They were small, likely from birds or rodents, and had been strung together with pieces of old twine. A few soiled feathers were tied in, and there were smudges of red paint on the larger bone fragments. I stared at it, keeping my distance. "What in the world is that?" Ben squinted. "Locals leave things like this. They're supposed to be protective symbols, some kind of folk ritual. My dad mentioned it once. Appalachian witchcraft." I didn't like the way it was spinning. There was no breeze, yet it rotated slowly, as if being nudged by something unseen, something watching or pointing at us. We pressed on, and the deeper we went, the more it felt as though we had entered a place where we were not welcome. By the time we caught sight of the fire tower, it was well past midnight. It rose from the treetops like a rusted skeleton, a structure of iron beams and missing sections. The base was choked with overgrown brush, and the stairs were clearly not safe. Some steps were gone entirely, while others were bent like crushed soda cans. I looked at Ben. "Are you sure this thing is going to support our weight?" He grinned. "Only one way to find out." We ascended slowly, gripping the railings tightly, as if we were climbing a piece of playground equipment. A few steps groaned under our weight, and I had to leap across one gap that made my stomach lurch. But we eventually made it to the top. The platform was warped, with metal grating bent at odd angles. The small cabin at the summit, where rangers likely used to sit, was still intact, but smelled of mold and something worse. A raccoon had probably taken up residence. We didn't investigate. Instead, we unrolled our sleeping bags on the open platform, cooked our ramen, and gazed up at the stars. For a little while, it actually felt magical. No noise, no distractions, just the two of us and the vastness of the sky. Then I heard it, a soft crunch from below. It wasn't a squirrel or a raccoon. It was something heavy. Ben's flashlight clicked off instantly. "Don't move," he whispered. We both froze. Step, pause, step, pause. It circled the tower once, then a second time. Slow, deliberate. There was no talking, no rustling, as if it were searching for something. Just the sound of those pacing footsteps. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my ears. I counted the steps in my head. 12, 13, 14. Then, silence. I don't know how long we remained like that. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour. Eventually, I started breathing again, telling myself it was just a hunter or another hiker who had seen our lights. At some point, I must have drifted off, but when I awoke, something felt wrong. Ben's sleeping bag was empty, the zipper pulled open the way he had left it. I sat up. "Ben," no response. I got up and crept to the edge of the platform, shining my light down. There was someone standing at the base. It wasn't Ben. The figure was tall and gaunt. Its arms hung incorrectly, too long, as if they didn't know their proper place. Its head was tilted, not in the way one looks up, but as if it were broken. The entire body appeared distorted, stretched. Then I heard Ben's voice. It came from the trees. "Josh, I need help." It was too clear, devoid of emotion, like a sound file being played back. Then it repeated the phrase, the exact same words, the exact same intonation. "Josh, I need help." I stumbled backward, my hands trembling. I didn't even realize I had drawn my knife. The figure below remained motionless. Then it began to climb, not using the stairs, but the beams themselves, its hands gripping the iron supports, its limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. There was no sound, only movement. I turned, my heart racing. The stairs behind me were gone, partially collapsed. There was no escape that way. The thing was halfway up. Then I heard it again. "Josh!" But this time, I knew it was Ben. His real voice, with real breath behind it. The creature stopped. Then it dropped. It just let go, as if its strings had been cut. I rushed to the edge. There was nothing there. It was gone. Seconds later, Ben burst out of the trees below, his face pale, his flashlight beam jerking wildly in his hand. "Go!" he screamed. "We have to go. The stairs." I started. "Slide down. Use the beams." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the nearest support pole, swung myself out, and dropped. I hit the ground and slid halfway down the slope before Ben caught up to me. We didn't exchange a word. We just ran, crashing through the trees like frightened animals, branches tearing at our clothes. I don't know how long we ran. It might have been hours. We made it back around dawn. When we got to the cabin, Ben slammed the door behind us and bolted it. Only then did he speak. He said he had gotten up to relieve himself and saw something. At first, he thought it was me, but it moved strangely, with jerky motions, as if it didn't understand how its own limbs worked. Then it stepped behind a tree and simply vanished. Story 3. I was 17 the summer my home life imploded. My parents were in a state of constant conflict. The subject didn't matter. Money, dirty dishes, the volume of the television, who had forgotten to buy toothpaste. Every minor issue escalated into a full-scale battle. I would sometimes come home from school and just sit in the car in the driveway, waiting for the shouting to subside, but it never did. One evening, following a particularly vicious argument that culminated in my dad throwing a chair, I sent a text to my mom from my room, telling her I needed to leave for a while. She didn't ask where I was going. She just replied, "Okay, be safe." My Uncle Travis owned an off-the-grid cabin near Franklin, West Virginia. It wasn't even on GPS, situated in the absolute middle of nowhere. I had only visited once as a child and remembered it being dull but peaceful. At that moment, dull and peaceful sounded like paradise. Travis was not a warm individual. He collected me from the bus station in silence, chewing sunflower seeds and spitting the shells into an old sports drink bottle. When we arrived at the cabin, it seemed smaller than I recalled. The wood siding had weathered to a dull gray. The screen door was hanging loose from one hinge, making a slapping noise whenever the wind blew. A porch swing was suspended by only one chain. The interior consisted of just 2 rooms and a bathroom. There was a wood-burning stove in one corner and a kitchenette that looked as though it hadn't been cleaned since the 1990s. The entire place had a faint odor of old coffee grounds and burnt wood. I noticed a dog bowl by the sink, but there was no dog. "Had a mutt years ago," Travis said when he saw me looking. "Died. Bowl's just there." He then gave me a set of rules. Don't follow the carved trees. Don't stay out after dark. And don't go west. I waited for a joke or perhaps an explanation. I received neither. He turned away, lit a cigarette, and the conversation was over. The following days consisted of me just walking. I had no cell phone service, and Travis didn't own a television or a radio, so I explored the surrounding area. The woods were dense, with hills rolling into more hills until I lost all sense of direction. Sometimes I would pause and just try to listen, but there were no discernible sounds. No birds, no squirrels, no rustling in the undergrowth. It was as if someone had hit a mute button. I started finding bones. At first, they were small ones, a bird skeleton here, a rabbit there. Then I found a raccoon with its rib cage exposed. They were always dry and picked clean, as if something had meticulously arranged them just off the trail. After a while, I learned not to look too closely, but the carvings, those were what disturbed me. Random trees had symbols etched deep into their bark, not initials or declarations of love, but strange designs, overlapping triangles, spider-like lines, concentric circles. One carving depicted what looked like 2 stick figures holding hands, but their heads were marked with X's. A few of them were surrounded by black handprints, about the size of a 5-year-old's. And the unsettling thing was, they moved. I would see one on a particular tree during a hike, and when I returned the next day, it would be gone, or it would have reappeared on a different tree entirely. I finally decided to ask about it. "What do the symbols mean?" I inquired over a dinner of eggs and toast that Travis had intentionally burned. He didn't look up from his plate, just mumbled, "Don't touch, don't follow, don't ask again." It was the first complete sentence he had spoken to me in days. One morning, I woke before sunrise, unable to sleep. I decided to venture farther than I had before. I packed some jerky and a flashlight into my backpack and set off down a narrow path I hadn't seen previously. It descended between 2 trees that were completely dead, as if they had been incinerated from the inside. The trail twisted strangely, as if trying to lead me in a circle without ever completing it. Then, it opened into a clearing. In the very center was a ring of stones, not randomly placed rocks, but evenly spaced and perfectly round, about 20 feet in diameter. Inside the circle, there was nothing. No leaves, no grass, not even insects, just hard-packed earth. And in the center of that, a tree stump. It was pale, as if it had been freshly cut, but it didn't resemble any of the surrounding trees. The cut was too smooth, with no bark or jagged edges. It looked out of place, as if it didn't belong there. I took a step closer, but I didn't enter the circle. That's when I saw the rope. It was hanging from a high branch, old, frayed, thick, and tied into a noose. It wasn't swinging wildly, just a slight, gentle motion, as if it had been recently disturbed. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, but there was no breeze. I turned around, and someone was standing there. He was about 10 feet away. He had no shoes, and his skin was like sun-cured leather. His shirt was stained dark at the collar and down his chest, and his ribs were visible, like a Halloween decoration. But his eyes were the most disturbing part, pale, unblinking, and far too wide. He wasn't breathing through his mouth. He was sniffing the air. The inhales were so deep and slow that I could hear a rattle in his chest. His hair hung in greasy strands on either side of his face. And his feet? They weren't resting on top of the moss. They were submerged in it, his toes curled deep into the ground. All I could manage to say was, "Sorry." I didn't shout or run right away. I just apologized, as if I had accidentally walked into the wrong restroom. He raised one hand and pointed at the stump. That's when I bolted. I ran as I had never run before in my life. I collided face first with branches and tore my palms on rocks. At one point, I slid down a hill and landed on my side so hard I thought I had broken a rib. My backpack was ripped open. The jerky was gone. The flashlight left somewhere behind me. I didn't care. I scrambled to my feet and kept running. The woods felt different, larger. I couldn't find any familiar landmarks. The trees seemed to lean at bizarre angles, as if they had twisted themselves while I wasn't looking. I would hear the sound of birds, then silence. The sound of water, then silence. It was just enough to make me doubt what I was hearing. When I finally stumbled back into the clearing near the cabin, the sun was nearly set. My shirt was in tatters, my knees were bleeding, and I had dirt in my teeth. Travis was waiting on the porch with his shotgun, not aiming it, just holding it in the way he always did. He looked at me for a moment and said, "You stepped into the wrong circle." I asked, "How do you know?" He didn't reply. That night, we didn't speak. He sat on the porch, and I sat on the couch. Around 1 in the morning, I began to hear footsteps. They weren't close, just at the edge of the woods. Long, slow strides, crunching dry leaves, and snapping twigs as if they were being broken intentionally. Then the voice came. "Mason," it whispered. I stood up. It sounded exactly like my mother, with the same tone she used when she couldn't find her keys. "Mason, help me. I'm lost." I moved toward the window. Travis reached out and grabbed my wrist, his grip firm. He shook his head once but said nothing. "Please," the voice pleaded. "Mason, I need you." It was my mother's voice, but distorted and drawn out, like a recording being played through a damaged speaker. I opened my mouth to say something, but Travis clamped his hand over it. We sat there for the entire night. The voice circled the cabin, moving from one side to the other, as if searching for an entrance. At dawn, it stopped. When we inspected the ground outside, there were footprints, bare feet, with the toes splayed wide. They made a complete circle around the cabin, stopped directly beneath my window, and then vanished. There was no trail leading away. I packed my bags that afternoon. Not much was said. Travis drove me to the bus station. Just before I got out of the truck, he said, "You were lucky." Then he drove away. I never told my parents what truly happened. I just said I got homesick. They didn't press for more information. 10 years have passed. I've moved twice and have a respectable job in Richmond. Life has settled into a routine that feels normal. The cabin, the woods, they remain in the back of my mind, like a nightmare you're not entirely sure you actually had. Story 4. I was 23 when I first attempted to go solo camping in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I had been on numerous weekend hiking trips before, mostly with friends and usually in areas close to home. These were typically day trips, or perhaps an overnight stay with a campfire, some beers, and an excessive amount of marshmallows. But those excursions were always as much about socializing as they were about the trail. This time was different. I was recovering from a difficult breakup and had just resigned from a job I despised. To be honest, I felt utterly stuck. I kept telling people I just needed a respite, but I think what I was really trying to do was prove to myself that I could manage being completely on my own. 4 days with no phone reception, no distractions, just me, my equipment, and whatever the wilderness held. The location I chose was just outside a tiny place called Ledger's Gap. It's so small it barely registers on a map, as if someone had made a typo that no one ever corrected. I had found it mentioned on a hiker's forum, where an old-timer described it as peaceful and never busy. That was its main attraction. I drove up with my car already packed. I had put my phone in airplane mode, told my sister my general destination, and brought along a printed map from the ranger station, just in case. No GPS, no social media. I even packed sparingly, just the essentials. A tent, a water filter, a few dehydrated meals, my knife, a small first aid kit, and a paperback mystery novel that had been gathering dust for a year. When I stopped for gas on the outskirts of Ledger's Gap, I asked the attendant if the Firebrush Trail was still open. He didn't even glance up from the counter, just gave a single nod and mumbled, "Yeah, always open." There was no smile, no cautionary advice, not even a simple, "Be careful." The atmosphere was strange, but I dismissed it as the awkwardness of a small town. I bought a bottle of water and continued on my way. The trailhead was little more than a gravel patch on a sharp curve in the road. A weathered wooden post stood there with a sun-bleached sign that read, "No maintenance beyond this point." There was no parking lot, no ranger kiosk, and no other vehicles in sight. It looked like the kind of place that had been forgotten. I locked my car, adjusted the straps on my pack, and stepped onto the trail. The first few miles were breathtaking. The path meandered between towering trees, with moss-covered trunks and low-lying shrubs that rustled as I passed. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. Occasionally, I would hear a woodpecker or see a squirrel darting through the underbrush, but for the most part, it was silent. It was peaceful, but also somewhat eerie. By late afternoon, I had hiked about 6 miles in and discovered a flat area of ground next to a creek. It wasn't an official campsite, but it was ideal. The soil was soft and free of rocks. There was a clear space for my tent and a small, nearby slope where I could sit and eat. I pitched the tent, filtered some water from the creek, boiled a pouch of chili on my miniature stove, and sat back on a log with my boots off, watching the stream flow by. That first night passed without any incident. I stayed up reading by the light of my headlamp, then crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep to the sounds of trickling water and whispering leaves overhead. The second morning, I decided to go for a light hike. My map indicated a rocky overlook about 2 miles further up the ridge. I left my tent and most of my gear behind, taking only a small day pack with snacks, water, and my map. As a precaution, I tore an old red t-shirt into strips and tied one to a branch every 100 yards or so to mark my trail. They were just simple, quick knots, intended to prevent me from getting disoriented. The hike up was uneventful, and I didn't encounter another soul. The trail became narrower and steeper the closer I got to the overlook, but I eventually reached the rock ledge described on the map. The view was truly magnificent. Layers of green stretched out in every direction, the treetops merging into a single, solid canopy. I sat on a boulder, ate some granola and jerky, and just listened. There were no cars, no voices, no airplanes overhead, only the wind, the leaves, and the sound of my own chewing. I stayed for about half an hour before starting back. It was around 2 p.m. when I returned to my camp, and that's when I saw it. About 20 feet from my tent, tied to a branch at shoulder height, was a strip of red cloth. It was the same color and fabric as my markers, but it wasn't one of mine. I walked over to it and immediately saw that the knot was different, tighter and more deliberate. My knots were just quick loops. This one looked practiced. The strip of cloth was also darker, as if it had been wet or perhaps dragged through the mud. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at it, trying to tell myself that I had tied it and simply forgotten. but that didn't seem plausible. I hadn't been in this particular part of the camp during my hike. The last marker I had tied was much further up the ridge. I double-checked all of my original markers, retracing the first part of the trail back toward the overlook. All of my knots were still in place. This new one didn't fit the pattern. It hadn't been there that morning. I didn't eat dinner that night. I zipped myself into my tent as soon as the sun went down, with my knife close at hand, and just lay there, listening. Every rustle outside seemed magnified. Every gust of wind made me jump, but nothing came. Nothing touched the tent. I didn't sleep much. By morning, I had made a decision. The ranger map showed a primitive shelter cabin about 8 miles deeper into the forest. I reasoned that if someone was trying to intimidate me, they wouldn't expect me to venture further in. The cabin would have 4 walls, possibly even a lock, and maybe an old ranger radio. I packed only what was essential and set out early. About 2 hours into the hike, the forest began to feel different. It wasn't menacing exactly, just still, as if everything had gone silent. The birds had stopped singing. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled. That's when I heard it. Movement up ahead. Quick, light steps. Too soft for a deer, too smooth for a raccoon. I stopped and called out, "Hello?" There was no reply. The trail forked about 50 yards ahead. The left path climbed steeply up a ridge, while the right one descended into a denser part of the valley. I stood there, trying to determine from the map which way I was supposed to go. Then I saw it. On a branch just up the left path was another red strip of cloth. It had the same knot as the one I'd found near my tent, and it was placed in the same manner. I didn't hesitate. I turned right and kept walking. I didn't stop again. I didn't consult the map. I just wanted to have walls around me. The shelter was barely standing, a single-room wooden shack with a dented tin roof and a crooked door that screeched when I pushed it open. The inside smelled of wood smoke and rodent droppings. There was an old shelf holding a rusty can of beans, a broken broom, and a pile of leaves in one corner. But it had a bolt on the door and a solid wall to lean against. I closed myself inside, lit a candle, and sat with my back to the wall, knife in hand. I didn't read. I didn't eat. I just listened. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. 2 slow knocks on the outer wall. It wasn't the wind or a branch. It was knuckles. I held my breath. A few minutes later, the door creaked slightly, just enough to hear the wood strain, as if someone had pressed their weight against it and then released it. That was all. I waited for hours, but nothing else happened. When the sky began to lighten, I shoved everything into my pack and bolted. I didn't bother to lace my boots properly. I didn't eat. I ran for nearly 10 miles straight, barely paying attention to the trail. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was still there. I leaned against it, gasping for breath, staring back at the trees, as if I expected something to follow me out. As I pulled out onto the road, I passed the old Ledger's Gap welcome sign, nailed to a post that I had hardly noticed on my way in. Story 5. By October, I found myself in western North Carolina, surrounded by rolling green hills and a forest that seemed to stretch to the horizon. I began my travels in state parks, but as the weather grew cooler and the weekend visitors became less frequent, I started venturing off the established trails. Fewer people meant more space to breathe. One misty afternoon, I pulled into a solitary gas station, just a single pump by a curve in the highway, hoping to get some advice on hidden trails. The clerk, a man with a friendly, crooked smile, told me about an old area just off the Blue Ridge Parkway. "Not many folks go out there," he said, in a tone that implied both a warning and a hidden gem. That was all the encouragement I needed. I arrived at the trailhead late on a Friday. It was a gravel lot with a sagging sign that was large enough to suggest the former presence of maps. There was only one other vehicle there, a red Subaru with a cracked taillight and a faded "Rescue Dogs Don't Shop" sticker on the bumper. A layer of dust covered the hood. It had the look of a vehicle that had been abandoned. I shrugged, parked my van nearby, and began to ready my pack. The path was steep for the first mile or so, just enough to be a stark reminder of gravity's pull. Then it transitioned into winding switchbacks, deep among hickory and oak trees, with underbrush as tangled as old rope. With each step, the world seemed to grow quieter, as if a mute button had been pressed on life. The birdsong faded, the wind became more subdued, and even the smells of the forest grew more subtle. There were no cars, no airplanes, just the trees and me. I hiked until I found a flat spot near a trickling stream, which seemed perfect for a campsite. The air was crisp against my face, but not yet freezing. I prepared some ramen on my small stove, gazed up at stars that felt unusually close, and let the profound stillness of the woods envelop me. Then midnight arrived. I sat bolt upright, startled awake. There had been no rustling, no one shouting my name, just a sudden jolt that sent me into a state of high alert. The walls of my tent were still. I barely dared to move. Then I heard it, tentative footsteps. They weren't the sound of small animals, but were heavy enough to be a person, crunching leaves about 20 feet away. One deliberate step, then a pause. A crackle, then another pause. Silence. About 5 minutes later, I cautiously unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. Nothing was moving. I could have sworn I saw a shadow flicker, but it might have been a trick of the moonlight. I didn't smell any wild animals. There was no growling or scuffing, just a slow, methodical walk around my campsite. I zipped the tent back up and tried to convince myself it was just a raccoon, or perhaps a particularly cautious bear. But I've heard bears moving around before. They grunt and sniff. This felt too light-footed, too human. The morning brought a chill to the air inside. The tent. I moved with urgency, packing my gear with one hand while holding my coffee in the other, the half-cooked noodles sloshing in their pot. I didn't wait for it to cool. I just crammed the whole thing into my pack and headed deeper into the woods, seeking a place that was quieter and farther from anyone else. Later that day, I discovered a mossy clearing with a forgotten fire ring. The stones so blackened they looked like ancient relics being consumed by the green. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I sat down, ate some jerky straight from the crinkling bag, and jotted down in my journal how strangely quiet it was out here. Simple observations, as if I were writing to a friend who would understand. Then the sun began to set. I walked about 20 feet from the clearing to gather some dead branches for a fire. That's when I froze. Between two trees, someone was standing there. There had been no footsteps, no snapping brush to announce their presence. They were just there, upright, watching. They were tall enough to be an adult man. I stopped breathing, my mouth suddenly dry. I thought perhaps they were lost, or looking for a place to camp. I called out, "Hey," but received no response. They barely moved when I took a step back, just a slight shift of weight. No wave, no acknowledgement, just a still, human form. So I turned, my heart pounding, and walked straight back to my camp, not running, but with a clear sense of purpose. I packed up my belongings by flashlight, with my knife in one hand and my headlamp next to my pillow. I don't think I slept for more than a few scattered minutes that night. Every snap of a twig or gust of wind had me sitting upright. By dawn, I had stuffed everything into my pack. There was no time for coffee or a leisurely morning. I quickly retraced my steps. The trail felt different now. The shadows seemed wrong. Rocks I thought I remembered were no longer there. I kept glancing over my shoulder. 2 miles from the parking area, I stopped. The Subaru was still there, but it wasn't where I had last seen it. It was off the trail, stationary, wedged between two tree trunks, as if someone had driven it in and left it. The hood was covered in pine needles, more than before. A window was cracked open. I walked all the way around the vehicle. There were no footprints leading into or out of the woods. There was no sign of a campsite. The interior was empty. No stove, no sleeping pads, no gear. Just a gray air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror, and a dark, dried smear on the back seat fabric. My chest tightened. I spun around and took off down the trail, breathing heavily, pumping my arms. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. My van was exactly where I had left it. The doors were locked, and there was nothing unusual around it. But the suffocating feeling of dread had not dissipated. I started the engine and drove away, without any particular destination in mind. A couple of hours later, I ended up at a cheap motel, with its fluorescent lights and a front desk clerk behind protective glass. I gave a fake name, paid in cash, and checked into my room. It smelled of cheap cleaning products, but I didn't care. I checked the lock, wedged a chair under the doorknob, and curled up in bed with my knife on the nightstand. I don't know what woke me, sometime around 3 a.m., but there was a slow, dragging scratch on the pavement outside, like heavy boots being dragged across concrete or asphalt, like someone pacing. I sat up, my ears ringing, and crawled across the bed to the peephole. A man was standing there, his back to me, staring at the tree line behind the motel. He was tall and wore a gray hoodie that was drenched at the bottom. His boots were heavy-looking and caked with mud up to his knees. He had no bag, no car, no flashlight. He didn't move for 10 minutes, just watched the woods. Then he turned and walked off into the darkness. My heart thudded in my chest. I sat on the floor with the knife in my lap. I didn't sleep again that night. By sunrise, I was gone. I didn't even bother to check out. I just drove until the headlights and billboards and the general buzz of civilization replaced the silence, until the cell phone signal bars reappeared on my screen, until I no longer felt like I was being followed, even though I know I probably was. I never went back. I never inquired about the Subaru. Story 6. I used to go hiking nearly every other weekend. There's a certain tranquility in being alone in the wilderness. No buzzing phone notifications, no traffic, no people asking for directions or making small talk. The trails behind Bell Ridge Hollow, West Virginia, felt like my own private corner of the world. They were quiet, wild, and remote. I would park my car by an old cattle gate, the kind with a sagging metal frame and a dangling chain, put on my pack, and begin my ascent. That day began like any other. The weather was cool, with just enough of a breeze to take the edge off a spring morning. After about 2 hours, the logging road I was on split into a fork. It looked intentional, almost manicured. I chose the right-hand path. That's when I saw it. A cairn, about waist high, with stones stacked with an almost obsessive precision. On the very top, in the center, lay a shard of red glass, flat and positioned like an eye staring up at me. I circled it, examining the glass and pondering its meaning. It made no sense. It wasn't a trail marker or a sign of any kind. Just that strange, glaring piece of glass, which seemed almost angry. Whatever, I thought, and kept moving. 30 minutes later, I came across another one. It was an identical cairn, but this time, sap was dripping down one side like thick syrup, slow and glistening. It looked as though it were weeping. The image almost rooted me to the spot. I just stared at it, then told myself, sap gets on rocks. There's nothing supernatural about it. Branches rustled overhead, and I scanned the trees, half expecting someone or something to materialize. But there was nothing. I found a flat spot in a dry stream bed and sat down. The gravel beneath me poked through my shorts, but the ground was level and easily accessible. I ate a granola bar first, a mix of oats, honey, and other ingredients. Then I chewed on some beef jerky. I glanced down at my GPS watch. It was frozen. It indicated that I was back near the road, at a location I had passed 30 minutes ago. It had a full signal. There was no reason for it to glitch. It seemed deliberate. I rebooted it, and it sputtered back to life, placing me back in the present. But after that, the forest felt sharper, its edges more defined. Every snap of a twig sounded louder. Branches creaked even when there was no wind. I zipped up my jacket and started walking faster than I had intended to. It didn't take long to find the third cairn. There was no red glass this time. Instead, someone had tied a strip of old flannel around the base rock, a faded red and blue pattern. It looked like the kind of shirt miners wore back in the 1930s. I remembered seeing photos of them in the Bell Ridge Museum. I crouched down to touch it. Just then, snap! A branch cracked loudly behind me, like a gunshot. I spun around. Nothing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't need to check my watch to know the time. It was close to 2:15 p.m. That dead zone of the afternoon when the sun feels oppressively heavy. I stuffed my tracker into my pocket and walked on. My plan was to reach the ridge and then head back, but just past a clump of old oak trees, the ground gave way. I slipped and found myself in a hollow that wasn't on my map. The air felt wet and heavy, as if rain had soaked everything in this particular spot, even though the rest of the trail had been dry. I felt trapped, as if I had been unnaturally moved. I made my way down using deer trails, which are inherently stealthy, silent, and instinctual. But the deeper I went, the stranger things became. Moss clung to the rocks in thick mats. Some of the stones looked as if they had been carved, with angles so sharp you would think a sculptor had been at work. That's when I saw it. A cabin. I had been in old cabins before, but this one was different. The roof was coated in dark soot, as if it had been exposed to a campfire for decades. The windows were so filthy they looked like mirrors in the dead of night. No glass, just grime. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, nothing to indicate it was occupied. But the footprints stopped me. A single pair, clear and deep. You could almost see the imprint of the arch. Someone had been there recently. I wish I had turned back then, but I didn't. I crept around to the back. Behind the cabin, someone had erected crosses in a muddy patch of ground. There were 7, maybe 9. It was hard to count. Each one was made of sharp, splintery wood, with a small pile of stones at its base. Sloppy, still wet sap dripped down some of them. And the red glass was there too, buried in the dirt around each cross. It looked ceremonial, as if someone had deliberately planted and arranged it. I wished I could unsee it. It got worse. A dog. At least, I thought it was a dog at first. It looked like a sculpture carved from a tree stump, but I swear it moved. It took a step and raised its head. Its legs were too thin and too long, like a dog drawn by someone who had never actually seen one. Its muzzle was stiff, and it stared at me without blinking. I froze, my blood pounding in my ears. I swear it tilted its head as if it were curious, and then it turned and simply disappeared into the trees. No bark, no rustle, just gone. I turned and ran. Every direction looked wrong. The trees and rocks blurred together. I tried to retrace my steps. Then I saw it. The first cairn again. It was in the same spot, but the top rock was gone. In its place was a circle of teeth. Human teeth, arranged like a wreath. Some were large, some were small. They were strangely polished, as if someone had scrubbed them clean. I closed my eyes and vomited in the leaves. I screamed into the woods, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. Then I ran harder. My GPS was dead again. I pulled out my phone and tried to call for help, but it died after one ring. No signal. I didn't care. I just ran downhill until my lungs and legs burned. I didn't stop until I reached the logging gate. A stump sat nearby. On it was a pair of boots. My boots. Not mine, but an identical pair. They were shiny, empty, and had a puddle of clean water inside each one. I didn't understand. There was something else, though. A Polaroid photograph, half stuck in the left boot. I pulled it out slowly, my hand shaking so badly that I had to fold the boot over and spill the water out to steady myself. The photo was of me, eating my lunch in the stream bed, taken from behind. It was the exact spot where I had been hours ago. There had been no shutter noise, no sound of a trail, just whoever or whatever had been watching me. I dropped the photo and ran. My car was at the gate when I got there. I opened the door and jumped in, but it felt as if I should still be hiking. I fumbled with the keys and missed the ignition twice before the engine caught. I didn't check my mirrors. I just slammed the car into gear and sped down the gravel road, loose stones kicking up behind me like rain. 10 miles later, I pulled into a roadside diner. It had wood-paneled walls, dusty booths, and single bulb lights hanging low. I sat and just stared at the coffee they brought me, my hands shaking so much that the mug clanked against the saucer. The waitress wrote on her pad with a pen that squeaked. She asked if I was okay. I managed to gurgle, "I need a ride," and didn't say another word. Not about the teeth, not about the cabin, not about the dog. That night, I scrubbed everything. Boots, pack, clothes, until the washer and dryer sounded like they were about to explode. I double-checked every lock and left the lights on all night. I kept the blinds shut. I couldn't sleep. I dozed fitfully, watching my front door, waiting for some proof that I had judged the situation wrongly, waiting for someone or something to peer through the darkness. 2 days later, the photo showed up in my mailbox. It was the same stream bed shot, but this time the frame was filled with a closer view of me, my face, my shirt, my bag, as if they had zoomed in. It wasn't just background noise or a random snapshot. It was deliberate and paused. I didn't open it. I just stared at the envelope. That was the last straw. I packed a box that night. 2 weeks later, I sold the house in Bell Ridge Hollow and moved away. Now, I only hike on marked trails, in parks with other people. If I ever come across a cairn that isn't on a trail sign, I turn around and leave. Story 7, I came across a strange post on an old hiking forum. It was buried deep within a thread about abandoned trails. There was no capitalization, just a long, rambling diatribe about a cave system somewhere near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. It didn't provide any coordinates or useful information, just some blurry photos of a rusty chain-link fence, half concealed by vines, on a ridge behind what the poster claimed was an old ranger station. But it was the last sentence that stayed with me. It read, "Turn around if you hear clicking. Don't keep going. I'm serious." That sentence lodged itself in my brain and refused to leave. Initially, I saved the post simply because it was so bizarre. But over the following weeks, I found myself returning to it, wondering if it could possibly be real. By the time June arrived, I had a week of vacation time and no plans. Curiosity had taken a firm hold of me. So, I packed my gear: a headlamp, a backup flashlight, a knife, some string, snacks, and a bivy sack, and made the 6-hour drive into the mountains. I set up camp near a fire road, just far enough off the grid that my phone became a useless paperweight. There was no signal, no digital maps, just me and the trees. The next morning, I followed the directions as best I could, using the landmarks mentioned in the post. First, I found the 2 birch trees that split at the base like a wishbone. Then, a fork in the creek. I took the left path. Finally, a long horseshoe-shaped curve in the slope led me directly to it. The ranger station looked as if it were being swallowed by the forest. The roof had collapsed, the door was hanging on by a splinter, and the windows were shattered. A wooden sign was leaning against the wall, reading Crow Hill Ranger Outpost. I hadn't seen it on any of the maps I had consulted before the trip. Behind the building, past some moss-covered boulders, I found the fence. It looked exactly like the one in the photo, old, tangled in vines, and bent outward at the bottom where something or someone had slipped through. So, I did the same. I followed what could barely be described as a trail. It wasn't really visible unless you were actively looking for it, just a shallow depression in the undergrowth. The climb took about 40 minutes. There were no birds, no insects. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and my own breathing. It felt as though the forest had been muted. Eventually, the ridge narrowed, and I spotted it, a crack in the rock on the north-facing slope. It didn't look like much, just a jagged slit in the limestone. I turned sideways and squeezed through, my backpack snagging on the edges. Inside, the temperature dropped rapidly. The air was damp and stale, so thick I could almost taste the minerals. I switched on my headlamp and tied one end of my spool of string to a rock near the entrance, a standard procedure for cave exploration. The passage twisted downward and deeper, and after a few turns, the daylight vanished completely. After about 20 minutes of careful walking, I entered a wider chamber. My light beam hit the walls, and I stopped in my tracks. There were carvings everywhere: spirals, stick figures, deep gouges. Some of them resembled people, but they were wrong. Their arms were too long, and their heads were either missing or shaped like circles. One figure had its hands raised toward a smaller one. It didn't look like art. It looked like someone was trying to document something. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, lifted it, and my headlamp flickered. I tapped the side, and the light steadied. I turned to leave. That's when I heard it. Just one sharp tap, echoing faintly from behind me. Click, click, click. It wasn't dripping water. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, as if it had meaning. I froze for about 3 seconds, then slowly began to back away toward the entrance, the string still in my hand. I turned my flashlight toward the tunnel behind me, and then the string jerked hard, as if someone had yanked it from the other end. I let go immediately. The clicking stopped. I waited, breathing heavily, straining to hear anything. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I caught a glimpse of movement, low to the ground, fast. Just a brief flash of pale skin and long fingers disappearing around a corner. That was all it took. I turned and ran. There was no thought, just pure instinct. My light swung wildly, bouncing off the walls. Every slope felt steeper, every turn tighter. I slipped and landed hard on my side, sliding down a rocky incline. My flashlight flew from my hand and skittered away. I crawled over to it and clicked it back on. My hands were shaking. I was in a smaller chamber with no apparent exit. Then the clicking started again, closer this time. I stood up and pressed myself against the wall, listening to it echo through the tunnel. Click, click, and then it stepped into view, crawling. It moved on all fours, its limbs bent in ways that didn't make sense, as if its joints were pointing in the wrong direction. Its skin was pale and stretched thin over its bones. It had no eyes, no nose, no face at all, just smooth skin with a thin slit where a mouth should have been. It held 2 small black stones in its hands. Click, click, click. Then it stopped moving, tilted its head, dropped the stones, and screamed. Not with its mouth. The sound came from everywhere, as if the cave itself were screaming. A horrible, metallic screech that rattled in my bones. My flashlight went out. I didn't wait to think. I dropped it and ran, with my arms outstretched, crashing into rock, clawing my way through tight gaps, and scrambling up slopes. My palms were shredded, and my knees were bruised. I didn't care. I just kept moving. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint sliver of daylight ahead. I forced myself through a crack in the rock and fell out onto the ridge. I didn't stop running until I reached the fire road, where I collapsed next to my car and lay there for what must have been an hour, just listening, waiting. Eventually, I drove home, but when I tried to find the forum post again, it was gone, deleted. There was no trace of it. The ranger station doesn't appear in any official records.